The secret that started everything. The evening had the kind of quiet glow that Lo's angels rarely granted its people. The sun was lowering behind the city's skyline, leaving a soft amber haze resting above the hills, and the breeze held a gentleness that made the leaves whisper rather than rustle. On a private terrace tucked above Mulholland Drive, Keanu Reeves stood alone with his hands resting on the railing, looking down at the shimmering city lights beginning to blink awake. He looked peaceful to anyone who didn't know him, but inside him lived a weight he had carried for years, a weight he had never fully expressed to anyone except in fragments, in partial truths, in quiet gestures. But tonight, for the first time, he knew the moment had arrived to speak the full truth. And the person he needed to speak it to was the same person he had quietly admired, respected, cherished, and protected for over 2 decades, Sandra Bullock. She was running late, not unusual, but Keanu didn't mind. He had learned long ago that Sandra moved through life not impatiently but with intention. When she arrived somewhere, she arrived fully, and tonight that mattered more than ever. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking in a deep breath, as though preparing himself to open a chapter that he had kept locked for far too long. It wasn't a confession of romance, nor a dramatic revelation that tabloids love to invent. It was something far more personal, far more vulnerable, and far more connected to the very essence of who he had become as a person. Behind him, the sound of soft footsteps echoed. He turned, and there she was, Sandra, wearing a simple black sweater, jeans, and the bright, unfiltered smile that had somehow survived decades of fame, heartbreak, responsibility, motherhood, and the relentless microscope of Hollywood. "You okay?" she asked gently, noticing something on his face, some heaviness, some thoughtfulness that she had learned to recognize instantly. Keanu gave a small nod. "Yeah, just thinking." Sandra stepped beside him, leaning her elbows on the railing, mirroring his posture. She knew he wasn't a man of unnecessary words, so she didn't push. Instead, she allowed silence to do what it often did between them, fill the air not with awkwardness but with understanding. The city lights below flickered like tiny stars, and the world felt so far away, yet strangely close at the same time. "You always think," she finally teased softly. "It's your superpower, that and making everyone feel safe around you." He chuckled under his breath. "I don't know about that." "Oh, I do," she replied, nudging his arm. "You've done it for me since the day we met." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something inside him shifted. It was time. After years of carrying the secret that shaped so much of who he was, he knew that Sandra, of all people, deserved to hear it, because she had unknowingly shaped him too. "Sandra," he began softly, "there's something I've wanted to tell you for years." She froze, not from fear, but from the sincerity in his voice. She could sense the emotional gravity behind his words, and her heart tightened a little. She didn't know whether to smile, to brace herself, or to comfort him. "Okay," she whispered, turning her body toward him fully. "I'm listening." Keanu swallowed, searching for the right words. Not dramatic ones, not rehearsed ones, just honest ones. "It's about something that happened before we met," he said slowly. "Something that shaped the person I tried to become after. And it's also about how you, unknowingly, helped me heal." Sandra blinked, surprised. "Me heal? Keanu, you give everyone else strength. I didn't know I ever." "You did," he said, cutting her off gently. "More than you know." She fell silent again, giving him space. Keanu rarely opened the vault of his past unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't shame. He had none of that. It wasn't secrecy. He never hid things out of pride. It was simply his nature. He lived quietly, respectfully, and with immense humility. But healing sometimes required speaking, and sometimes required choosing a person who could hold the truth without judgment, without exploitation, without trying to turn his vulnerability into a spectacle. Sandra was that person. He inhaled slowly. "You remember when we filmed Speed," he started, "and everyone kept saying how natural our chemistry was." Sandra laughed softly. "Of course, today they're still saying it. Apparently we ruined the bar for on-screen chemistry forever." Keanu smiled faintly, then his expression turned thoughtful again. "Back then, you made me laugh more than I had laughed in years. You brought light into a part of my life that, honestly, had gotten really dark." Sandra's smile faded into something tender. Her eyes softened. She didn't interrupt. "There was something I never told you," he continued. "Something I never told anyone on set." Her heart thumped quietly. She nodded, encouraging him. Keanu looked at the horizon again, gathering strength from the fading sunlight. "The year before we met," he said carefully, "I made a promise to myself, a personal vow. I promised that if I ever had the chance again, I would treat the people in my life with more gratitude than I had before. I would never take a single moment of kindness for granted." Sandra's expression grew puzzled but warm. "Keanu, why would you promise that? You're already one of the kindest people I've ever met." He lowered his gaze, and she saw something in his eyes, something like an old ache resurfacing. "Because," he whispered, "I lost someone who taught me what it meant to be loved generously, and I didn't realize how deeply they shaped me until they were gone." Sandra's breath caught. She knew he had faced tragedies. She knew he carried quiet scars, but she had never heard him speak of them with such vulnerability. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't know." "No one did," he replied. "Because I shut down emotionally. I thought shutting down would protect me, but instead, it made me feel like I was fading from the world." He paused. "And then I met you." Sandra's eyes widened, her lips parting in stunned silence. "You came into my life like you were carrying this breeze," he said, searching for words. "Something warm, something real, something hopeful. You didn't know me. You didn't know what I had gone through. But you treated me with such genuine kindness, like I was someone worth believing in. You made me feel human again." Sandra's throat tightened. She blinked rapidly, trying to stop her eyes from filling. "Keanu," she whispered. "You made me want to be better," he said. "Not for a role, not for publicity, not for anyone else, for me." Her voice shook when she answered. "You've always been good, Keanu, always. You just forget to see yourself the way the world sees you." He laughed softly, humbled. "Maybe, but the truth is, you gave me a reason to step back into the world instead of hiding from it." Sandra lifted her hand and rested it gently on his arm. "I had no idea," she murmured. "I know," he whispered, "because I never told you, but you changed my life, Sandra, and I think you deserve to know that." She inhaled shakily. Tears were welling in her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let them fall, not yet. She wasn't ready. "Why tell me now?" she finally asked. Keanu exhaled a long, slow breath. "Because for years, I've been carrying gratitude for you that I never expressed, and gratitude that isn't spoken becomes regret. I don't want any regrets with you." Those words struck her like a gentle, emotional blow, unexpected yet healing. And he added softly, "There's more." Sandra straightened a little. "More." Keanu nodded slowly, his voice tightening. "I have a secret, something I've kept quiet not out of shame, but because I didn't know how to say it without feeling like I was reopening a wound." A hush fell over the terrace. Sandra felt her heartbeat grow heavier. "You can tell me anything," she whispered, "anything." He looked at her then in a way he rarely did, a way that stripped all the layers of poise and calm and humility, revealing the deeply human core beneath. "The reason I promised myself I would never take kindness for granted," he said, "was because the last conversation I had with someone I loved, I wasn't present, I was distracted. I didn't give them the attention they deserved, and I've carried that with me every day." Sandra's breath trembled. "Keanu, that isn't your fault." "Maybe not," he said softly, "but it taught me something important, something I've lived by ever since." He stepped a little closer, not romantic, not dramatic, just honest. "It taught me that people don't stay forever. Opportunities don't stay forever. Moments don't stay forever. So when we care about someone, we should never leave gratitude unspoken." Sandra pressed her lips together, her chest tightening painfully. She had wanted to cry earlier, but now the emotion felt deeper, like something was pulling at her heart, urging her to respond not as Sandra the actress, not as Sandra the public figure, but as Sandra the human being. "And that's what you wanted to tell me?" she asked softly. "That I mattered to you back then?" Keanu shook his head. "That's only half," he said. "The other half is that you still matter, maybe more than ever." The world seemed to still. The breeze stopped. The lights below blurred as moisture gathered in her eyes. "Keanu," she whispered, her voice nearly breaking, "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied gently. "Just let me finally tell you the truth I never had the courage to say." Sandra looked down briefly, pressing her lips together, her breath unsteady. Her eyes glistened, the tears dangerously close to falling. And Keanu, noticing the shift in her expression, softened even more. "Sandra," he said quietly, The secret I've been holding all these years isn't about something painful that happened to me. It's about something meaningful that came after. Her eyes lifted to meet his, searching. It's about you, he said, and the way you unknowingly helped me rebuild my life after I thought I had nothing left to give. A tear slipped down Sandra's cheek before she could stop it. She brushed it away quickly, embarrassed, but Keanu shook his head gently. It's okay, he whispered. You don't have to hide that. She laughed breathlessly, emotional. You're going to make me cry, Reeves. Then cry, he said softly. It means your heart still feels deeply, and that's one of the things I admire most about you. Sandra inhaled sharply, overwhelmed. This wasn't a romantic confession. It wasn't a dramatic Hollywood moment. It was something real, two souls acknowledging the invisible threads that had tied them for decades. Two people who had carried each other without even realizing it. Keanu, she whispered again, her voice trembling. I had no idea I meant that much to you. You always have, he replied simply. And then, finally, she allowed the tears to fall. Not from sadness, but from the weight of being valued, truly valued. It was a moment that neither of them would ever forget, a moment that marked the beginning of a deeper understanding, a deeper bond, and a deeper story. One shaped not by fame or roles or gossip, but by gratitude, kindness, healing, and truth. For the first time in years, Keanu felt the weight on his heart grow lighter. And for the first time in years, Sandra realized that the person she had admired for so long had quietly been admiring her too. The air on the terrace had shifted after Sandra's tears finally escaped, not in a way that made either of them uncomfortable, but in a way that deepened the quiet trust already woven between them for decades. Keanu had always known Sandra as someone gifted with warmth, humor, intelligence, and resilience, but seeing her now, eyes glistening in the amber light, breathing through the emotional truth he had finally shared, made him realize how long he had kept a part of himself locked away simply because he feared burdening others. And yet with her, he felt none of that fear. He felt understood, valued, and strangely relieved, as though something in him had been quietly waiting for this moment without ever fully acknowledging it. Sandra's tears were not a sign of weakness, but a reflection of how deeply she cared, not only about him, but about emotional honesty itself. She had always carried an open heart, even when she hid it behind jokes, charm, and effortless Hollywood composure. And tonight, the mask had slipped away, revealing the raw humanity underneath. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't heavy, it was soothing, like a long exhale from souls that had been holding too much for too long. Sandra wiped her cheeks gently and sighed, finally lifting her gaze to meet Keanu's. You really kept all of that inside? She whispered, her voice trembling not from sadness but from disbelief. All these years you never said anything. Keanu nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than regretful. I didn't know how, he admitted. When people see you as strong or quiet or put together, they rarely imagine you're carrying something fragile inside. And when you try to explain it, sometimes it feels like you're breaking your own armor. He gave a small, humble smile. I guess I didn't want anyone to see the cracks. Sandra exhaled deeply, her shoulders softening. I wish you had told me, she murmured. Not because I needed to know, but because you didn't deserve to go through that alone. You still don't. There was an honesty in her voice that made Keanu feel an unexpected tug inside his chest. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't anything forced or scripted. It was real friendship, real connection, real human care. The kind that felt rare in a world where so much was transactional, performative, or temporary. I know that now, he said quietly. But back then, I didn't know how to trust myself with vulnerability, let alone trust someone else with it. Sandra gently nudged his arm again, a gesture she often used when words weren't enough. Well, she said, attempting a small smile through her lingering tears, you finally did it, and I'm honored that you chose me. Keanu's heartbeat tightened slightly, moved by the sincerity in her tone. I chose you because you always saw me without trying to label me. You never treated me like an image or a role or a rumor. You treated me like a human being. That's because you are one, she replied softly. A good one. He chuckled, a warm, grounded sound, but Sandra's expression didn't shift. She meant it. She meant every word. And for a moment the compliment lingered between them, genuine and heartfelt and carrying more weight than she probably realized. She stepped back from the railing then, inhaling a slow breath to steady her emotions. You know, she said, I always thought you were the strong one between us, the steady one, the the one who never needed saving. I never imagined that something I did, something as small as being kind or joking around with you, could have meant so much. Keanu shook his head. It wasn't small, Sandra, not to me. Her lips parted slightly, touched by the depth in his voice. She folded her arms loosely, not guarded but self-soothing as she leaned back against the terrace railing. The breeze swept a few strands of hair across her face and she pushed them away, laughing softly at herself. It's strange, isn't it? She said thoughtfully. How we can love, help, or inspire people without even knowing it, how something tiny to us can be life-changing to someone else. That's why gratitude matters, he replied gently. Why speaking it out loud matters. Sandra nodded slowly, absorbing the truth in his words. And I guess I've been guilty of staying quiet too, she said after a moment. Not because I'm ungrateful, but because sometimes I don't want to make things heavy or emotional or complicated. She paused, then added quietly, but I've been carrying my own truths too. Keanu's brows softened with concern. You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share. Sandra shook her head. No, she whispered, I want to. Tonight feels right. She looked out over the city for a long moment, her eyes reflecting small fragments of the shimmering lights below. Then she closed her eyes for a brief second, as if gathering courage before turning back to him. There was a time, she began carefully, when I felt like I had to pretend to be strong even when my life was falling apart, when I felt alone even in a room full of people, when fame felt like a shield and a prison at the same time. Her voice softened. And you were there during some of those years, not fully aware of what I was going through, but there nonetheless. You always offered kindness without knowing why I needed it. Keanu listened without interrupting, his expression calm and steady, grounding her as she continued. You always made things lighter, she whispered. You gave peace without even meaning to, and when people treated me like a product or a headline, you treated me like a person. I didn't realize how much that mattered until much later. Her words hit him unexpectedly deep. When I was struggling, she said, emotion tightening her throat, you unknowingly gave me a place where I didn't have to perform, a place where I could just breathe. Her voice cracked. She looked away quickly, embarrassed, but Keanu stepped forward, not to touch her, not to overwhelm her, but to stand closer, offering presence rather than pressure. You never owed me strength, he said softly. You never had to hide with me. Sandra's laugh was soft and painful. Old habits die hard. He tilted his head, studying her with quiet empathy. What were you going through back then? She hesitated, not from reluctance, but from vulnerability. Loneliness, she said finally. Even with success, even with people around me, even with the world thinking I had everything. Keanu's heart tightened. He knew loneliness intimately, how it crept up even when the world praised you, how it hollowed out the spaces success couldn't fill. And I think, Sandra continued, I think I started believing that my worth came from what I achieved instead of who I was. But then you reminded me that I didn't have to earn kindness, that I didn't have to pretend around everyone. Keanu exhaled slowly. You didn't. I know that now, she whispered, because of you. Keanu didn't know what to say, not because he lacked words, but because he felt deeply honored in a way that almost overwhelmed him. Sandra wiped her cheek again, this time with a shaky laugh. Are we just going to take turns emotionally ambushing each other tonight? He smiled gently. Maybe we need it. Sandra inhaled, her chest rising and falling slowly. Maybe we do. There was a pause, long, warm, reflective. Then Keanu spoke again. Sandra, there's still something I haven't said. She blinked, taken aback. More. He nodded. Yes, the real reason I invited you here tonight. Sandra's heart skipped, one beat, then two, as she studied his face. His calmness had changed slightly. There was a seriousness now, a soft intensity that made the air feel heavier, but in a meaningful way. What is it? She asked quietly. Keanu walked toward the small wooden table near the railing and picked up a small envelope resting there. Sandra hadn't noticed it earlier. It was plain, unmarked, elegant in its simplicity, something he must have been debating whether or not to use for hours before she arrived. He held it gently, almost reverently, before turning back to her. This, he said softly, is something I wrote years ago, something I never planned to show you. Sandra's breath trembled. Why not? Because, he said with rare vulnerability, I wrote it during one of the darkest periods of my life, and at the time it felt too raw, too emotional, too revealing. Her heartbeat quickened. Keanu. He stepped closer, the envelope still in his hand but held delicately, as though it might crumble if handled too roughly. I wrote it on the last day of filming Speed, he said, when I realized how much you changed my life without even knowing it, and I didn't know how to say any of it out loud. Sandra blinked, stunned into silence. I never sent it, Keanu continued. But I kept it, for years, because it reminded me that even in the darkest times, there were people who brought light. Sandra felt her entire body go still. Her voice was barely a whisper. You wrote a letter for me. Keanu nodded. Why show it to me now? She asked softly. He swallowed. Because I think it's finally time you know the truth, not the polished truth, not the quiet gratitude, the real truth. Sandra reached for the envelope slowly, almost cautiously, as though receiving something sacred. Her fingers brushed his lightly, warm, gentle, grounding, and for a moment she didn't move. She simply looked at him, searching his eyes for reassurance. Are you sure? She asked quietly. Yes, he whispered, I trust you. That simple sentence felt heavier than anything else he had said all night. Sandra held the envelope to her chest, overwhelmed. Can I read it? She asked, her voice softer than the evening breeze. Keanu nodded again, of course. But before she could open it, he gently placed his hand over hers, not to stop her, but to add one more truth. Sandra, he said, whatever you read in there, just know it came from a version of me who was trying his best to heal, and you were part of that healing, a big part. Her eyes softened, filling again. I'm honored, she whispered, truly. And Sandra, he added softly, there's one more thing. She laughed weakly, emotional. Oh God, does it ever end? He smiled, gentle, humble, sincere. This part isn't sad, it's something I realized recently. She waited. You always ask why people love you so much, he said. Why the world gravitates toward you, why fans adore you, why friends rely on you, you always act surprised when people choose you. Sandra inhaled, startled by how accurate that was. Well, he continued, I think I finally understand why. She tilted her head, curious and touched. Why? Keanu gave a small, tender smile, the kind that reached his eyes. Because you make people feel seen, he said. You make them feel like they matter, and for someone like me, who spent years believing he didn't matter, that meant more than you'll ever know. Sandra pressed a hand over her mouth, tears rising once more, not from sadness, but from the rare and overwhelming experience of being truly understood. Keanu, she whispered brokenly. He stepped back, giving her space to feel everything without pressure. And Sandra, after years of strength, years of composure, years of carrying her own unspoken burdens, allowed herself to cry openly in front of him, not out of weakness, but out of the deep healing that comes when someone finally says the words your heart has needed to hear for a lifetime. It was not a confession of love. It was not a dramatic Hollywood revelation. It was something far more powerful. A moment of truth between two people who had unknowingly carried each other through life's quietest storms. And tonight, for the first time, they finally understood just how deeply their lives had been intertwined. Not by accident, not by fame, not by circumstance, but by the quiet resilience of the human spirit. The envelope in Sandra's hands felt heavier than paper. It carried years of unspoken emotion, quiet gratitude, and the kind of sincerity that rarely made its way into spoken conversation. She held it against her chest for a moment, grounded by the warmth of Keanu's presence beside her, but overwhelmed by the weight of something she had never expected. A truth written for her long ago, preserved through time, and finally revealed on a night when their hearts were open enough to face it. The terrace lights glowed softly around them, casting a warm, golden hue over the space, but everything seemed dim in comparison to the emotional brightness swelling between them. Two souls standing on the edge of a truth that had waited decades to be acknowledged. Sandra sat down slowly on the cushioned bench near the railing, feeling the cool night air brush across her skin, grounding her in the present moment as her fingertips traced the edges of the envelope. Keanu remained standing for a moment, unsure whether to sit beside her or give her space. Sandra looked up at him through watery eyes, offering a small nod, an unspoken invitation. He sat next to her, not too close, not too far, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, steadying her trembling heartbeat. She took a slow breath and opened the envelope with delicate care, unfolding the slightly aged sheet of paper. The ink had faded only a little, but the emotion in the handwriting felt unmistakably alive. She glanced at Keanu once more, searching his expression for reassurance, and he gave a gentle smile meant only for her, a silent reminder that she was safe, that whatever she read was a piece of his truth, not a burden meant to weigh her down. Sandra lowered her eyes to the first line of the letter and slowly began to read. Sandra, if I never find the courage to say this out loud, I hope one day I can give you these words without fear. Her breath hitched. She pressed a hand over her mouth, steadying herself before continuing. The letter was written in Keanu's familiar, careful handwriting, every stroke deliberate, gentle, and honest. You may not know this, but you changed the course of my life in ways I don't know how to express. Before we started filming, I felt lost. I felt disconnected from myself. But then you walked into my life with laughter, grace, and a kind of sincerity I had forgotten existed. Sandra bit her lip, fighting the fresh wave of emotion rising in her chest. Keanu watched her quietly, respectfully, letting her have the moment. She continued, You reminded me that kindness doesn't have to be grand to be powerful. Sometimes it's in the smile someone gives you without asking why. Sometimes it's in the way someone listens without trying to fix you. Sometimes it's in the way someone simply stands beside you, even when they don't know they're holding you up. A soft sob escaped her before she could stop it. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but not from sadness, from the overwhelming realization that someone she admired deeply had been carrying this silent gratitude for her all these years. She kept reading, her voice barely holding steady. I don't know what the future holds for either of us, but I do know this: I will always be grateful for your presence in my life. You are a light, Sandra, a real one, and if you ever forget that, I hope this letter reminds you. Sandra pressed the letter against her chest, closing her eyes as the tears continued to fall. Keanu, she whispered, barely able to form the word. Why didn't you ever give this to me? Keanu exhaled slowly, his voice soft. Because I didn't know if it would help you or overwhelm you, and because I didn't want you to feel like you needed to say anything back. I wrote it for myself as much as for you. A way to keep a promise to be grateful, even if the words stayed unspoken. Sandra shook her head, overwhelmed. You kept this all these years. Yes. You wrote this at a time when you were hurting, and you still thought about me. He nodded gently. You were the first person who made me feel safe again. Sandra wiped her cheeks with trembling fingers. I wish I had known. I wish I could have been there for you the way you were for me. You were, he said softly, more than you realized. She looked at him, really looked at him, with a mixture of gratitude, heartbreak, admiration, and an emotion she couldn't yet name. Something deep, something unspoken, something that had lived between them quietly for years, never forcing itself into existence but never disappearing either. You're going to make me cry again, she murmured, attempting a small laugh through her tears. He smiled softly. I think we're both doing that tonight. Sandra looked at the letter again, her fingertips tracing the words he had written long ago. This is one of the most beautiful things anyone has ever said to me, she whispered, and you kept it inside for years. I wasn't ready, Keanu said honestly, and maybe you weren't either. She nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in that. Life had taken them in different directions. They had experienced heartbreak, grief, joy, success, mistakes, growth. There had been times when they had drifted apart for years, then reconnected as though no time had passed at all. Their bond was not built on constancy, but on sincerity. Not on daily interaction, but on mutual respect and an emotional closeness deeper than most friendships dared to be. What made you ready now? Sandra finally asked. Keanu leaned back slightly, his gaze falling to the city lights in the distance. Because I realized something important recently, he said softly. Life doesn't wait, it doesn't pause, it doesn't give us second chances to say the things that matter most. And I didn't want another year to go by without you knowing what you meant to me back then, and what you mean to me now. Sandra's breath shook. And what do I mean to you now? Keanu turned toward her fully. His expression was gentle but unwavering, sincere but steady. You are one of the few people I trust completely, he said. You are someone whose presence brings peace. You are someone I admire, not for your fame, not for your success, but for your heart. You faced battles the world knows nothing about, and you still choose kindness. You still choose hope. You still choose to laugh. Sandra's eyes filled again, but this time with a soft ache, an ache of being seen so deeply that it pierced her defenses. "You talk about me like I'm this incredible person," she whispered. "You are," Keanu said simply. "You always have been." Sandra looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of the letter, trying to steady her breathing. For so long she had carried her own doubts, about her worth, about her vulnerability, about her emotional wounds that fame never healed. She had often questioned whether people liked her for who she truly was or for the roles she played, the smiles she performed, the persona she maintained. But Keanu's words sliced through all the noise, reaching the part of her she kept hidden even from herself. She finally looked up at him again, her voice barely audible. "Can I tell you something too?" "Anything." "There were days on set," she said slowly, "when I was struggling so much, with relationships, with insecurities, with the pressure of the industry, and your kindness felt like a life jacket. You had this calmness that made everything feel less heavy. You didn't even know what I was going through, but your presence helped me more than you can imagine." Keanu's expression softened further, moved. "I'm glad I could be that for you." Sandra took another breath, deeper this time. "And there's something I never told you either," she continued. "Something I was too afraid to admit." Keanu's brows lifted slightly, his attention sharpening. "I always felt a connection with you," she said quietly. "A deep one, not romantic, not the way people want to make it, but something real, something enduring. You felt safe. You felt familiar even when we first met, like my soul recognized you." Keanu's chest tightened at her words. "I felt that too," he said softly. "I just didn't know how to describe it." Sandra smiled gently through her tears. "I guess we didn't need to describe it, we just lived it." There was a long, emotional silence between them, one filled with years of unspoken sentiment finally given light. The night around them felt warmer, as though the universe itself had leaned in to witness the moment. Finally, Sandra folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope, holding it with reverence. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she whispered. "I'll keep it safe." "You don't have to keep it at all," Keanu said. "If it brings up too many emotions, if it feels like too much." "No," she interrupted softly. "It's a gift, one I didn't know I needed." Keanu nodded, relief flickering across his expression. Sandra looked at him thoughtfully, something shifting in her gaze. "You know," she said quietly, "people talk about you like you're mysterious or private or hard to understand. But the truth is, you're one of the most emotionally honest people I've ever met. You just choose your moments carefully." He laughed lightly. "Maybe." "Definitely," she said, smiling slightly. Then her expression turned serious again. "And tonight, you gave me something I'll never forget." Keanu looked at her, really looked, and in that moment, something in him softened even more, if that was even possible. He didn't say anything, but Sandra saw everything she needed in his eyes. The night deepened around them, and the city lights shimmered brighter. Sandra leaned back against the cushions, the emotional weight slowly transforming into something gentler, something healing. Keanu sat beside her, quiet but content, as though releasing the secret had freed a part of him he hadn't realized was still chained to his past. "You know," Sandra said after a long moment, her voice steadying, "it's strange how life works. We meet so many people, but only a few leave fingerprints on our soul. You're one of those people for me." Keanu turned his head toward her, his voice warm. "You're one of those people for me too." Sandra smiled, a real tender smile that crinkled her eyes and softened her whole face. "So what now?" she asked gently. Keanu took a thoughtful breath. "Now, we move forward with honesty, no more unspoken gratitude, no more quiet regrets." Sandra nodded slowly. "I'd like that." "And Sandra," he added softly. "Yes. There's still one more thing I haven't told you." Her heart skipped. "Another secret." He smiled faintly. "Not a secret, just something I realized tonight." She waited, her expression open. "You're stronger than you know," he said quietly, "and softer than you admit, and those two things together make you extraordinary." Sandra swallowed hard, touched beyond measure. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, not as an actress, not as a public figure, but as a human being. She exhaled slowly. "Thank you, Keanu." He shook his head gently. "No, thank you." As the night continued, their conversation shifted from heavy truths to lighter memories, but the emotional shift between them remained steady and undeniable. Something had changed. Something had deepened. Something had awakened that had been asleep for years. And neither of them wanted to run from it anymore. The night had grown deeper, settling into a quiet stillness that wrapped around the terrace like a warm blanket. The city lights glittered below, but they felt like distant reflections of the much brighter emotional lights shifting between Sandra and Keanu. After the letter, after the tears and shared truths, the air carried a sense of intimacy, not romantic, not dramatic, but profoundly human. The kind of intimacy that came from vulnerability, from honesty, from allowing someone to see the fragile parts you usually hide. Sandra held the envelope on her lap, her fingers brushing its edges every so often as if grounding herself in the reality of the moment. She wasn't used to being the recipient of such emotional transparency, especially from someone like Keanu, who was known by the world for his quiet strength, but rarely for his deepest internal landscape. And he wasn't used to letting anyone see the parts of him that he had spent years quietly protecting. But tonight, something in both of them had cracked open in the gentlest, most necessary way. For a while they didn't speak, not because they had nothing to say, but because the silence felt sacred, like a space where their hearts were still catching up with everything that had been revealed. Sandra leaned back against the cushion, looking up at the sky. Clouds drifted slowly across the moon, creating shifting shadows that danced on the terrace floor. Keanu watched her for a moment, noticing the way her expression softened into something contemplative, almost peaceful. It reminded him of the first time he had seen her truly let her guard down years ago, laughing so hard on set that she forgot to act, forgot to perform, forgot to be Sandra Bullock the actress, and simply became Sandra, the human being. He had always treasured those rare glimpses, even when he didn't fully understand why. "You know," Sandra finally said, breaking the silence with a gentle exhale, "I spent years thinking you were the strong one, the grounded one, the one who didn't need anyone." She turned her head, meeting his gaze. "But tonight made me realize something I should have noticed a long time ago." Keanu lifted an eyebrow, slightly curious. "What's that?" "That you've been carrying so much alone," she said softly. "More than most people can imagine, and you've been doing it quietly with grace without asking for help. But even the strongest people need someone to lean on sometimes." Keanu looked down at his hands, a small, humble smile crossing his face. "Maybe I just didn't want to burden anyone." Sandra shook her head gently. "You're not a burden, you never were, and you never will be, especially not to me." The sincerity in her voice warmed something inside him. He had heard similar words before, but never with this level of emotional clarity, never from someone who had unknowingly shaped so much of his healing. He leaned back slightly, looking up at the sky as well. "I guess we both learned to build our worlds on silence," he said quietly. "Hiding pain behind humor or behind calmness or behind the roles people expect from us." Sandra nodded with a rueful smile. "Hollywood teaches us to smile even when we're breaking inside, and it punishes us if we show too much vulnerability. But the strange thing is, the moments when I've been most real, the moments when I've shown the cracks, those are the moments people connected with me the most." Keanu turned his head slightly. "Maybe that's what makes you so loved." Sandra's laugh was soft, breathy, tinged with disbelief. "I don't always feel that way." "You don't have to feel it for it to be true," he said gently. She took in his words like a balm, letting them settle in her chest. And then, shifting slightly, she asked the question that had been lingering in the back of her mind since he handed her the letter. "Keanu, what made you keep it, all these years?" He paused, thinking. The breeze rustled the nearby olive tree, and the sound filled the quiet space between them. "Because it reminded me of who I wanted to be," he said finally. "A person capable of expressing gratitude, a person capable of healing, a person capable of connection." He turned to her. "And it reminded me that even when I felt broken, there were still people who saw the good in me, people like you." Sandra's eyes softened again, tears threatening to rise but contained this time by a newfound steadiness. "I'm glad I mattered," she whispered. "You didn't just matter," he said. "You helped pull me back into the world." She swallowed hard, her voice thickened. "Then I'm glad I was there." The emotion between them deepened once more, but now it wasn't heavy. It was comforting, like two people finally recognizing the importance they had always held in each other's lives. After a moment, Sandra asked, "Did you ever write letters for anyone else? Anyone who meant something to you?" Keanu shook his head. "No, that was the only one." Sandra inhaled sharply, understanding the magnitude of his admission. "So I was the only one." "You were the only one who changed something in me," he said quietly. "The only one who made me want to hold on to hope again." Her hand lifted instinctively, not to touch him, but to cover her heart. Keanu. He gave a small smile, not shy but sincere. It isn't a confession, it's just the truth. She nodded slowly, absorbing his words fully. And you have no idea how much it means to hear it. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Two people stripped of their public personas, talking not as actors, not as colleagues, not as subjects of endless rumors, but as human beings sharing emotional ground they had never dared to explore before. Then Sandra inhaled deeply, as if preparing to reveal something of her own. There's something I've never told you either, she said slowly. Something I've kept inside for years, thinking it wasn't important enough to say. But now, after everything you've shared, I think it's time. Keanu turned fully toward her, attentive but gentle. I'm listening. Sandra hesitated for a moment, her fingers tightening slightly around the letter before loosening again. When we were filming Speed, I was going through a difficult time personally, she said. I was unsure of myself, unsure of my place in the industry, unsure of my future. I felt like the world expected me to be perfect, happy, confident. But inside, I felt lost. Keanu's brow softened with empathy. I didn't know that. I didn't let anyone know, she admitted. But you, without even realizing it, made me feel like I could be myself. You never judged me, you never tried to impress me, you never treated me like someone who needed to be flawless. You just treated me like Sandra, like a normal person, like someone who didn't need to pretend. Keanu's voice softened. You never needed to pretend with me. Sandra smiled faintly. But back then I still did, and the truth is you were the first person in a long time who made me feel safe, seen, and real. Keanu's heart tightened. I wish I had known. She shook her head gently. Maybe you didn't need to know, maybe it was enough that you were just you. They shared a long, emotional breath. Then Sandra added in a softer voice than before, and there's something else too. Keanu waited patiently. I always admired your kindness, she said, but not in the way the world sees it. People talk about your generosity, your humility, your calmness, but I admired something deeper. The way you treat absolutely everyone with respect. The way you listen, the way you never make anyone feel small. Her voice trembled. Do you know how rare that is in this industry? He looked away for a moment, humbled. I just try to treat people the way I want to be treated. Sandra shook her head. No, Keanu, you do more than that. You treat people the way they deserve to be treated, even when the world forgets they deserve it. Her words settled over him like a warm blanket, soothing and validating. No one had ever articulated his quiet intentions so clearly before. They fell silent again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was reflective, filled with gratitude and mutual understanding. After a moment, Keanu exhaled slowly. Sandra, I want to tell you something I've never said out loud. Sandra turned her head, attentive. I spent so much of my life trying to protect other people, trying to be stable, reliable, calm. But no one ever asked me what I needed. No one ever wondered if I needed support, and for a long time I convinced myself I didn't. Sandra felt her throat tighten. And do you? She whispered. He looked at her, his gaze steady and open. I think I always did, I just didn't know how to ask. Sandra's voice softened into a breath. You don't have to ask with me. His chest rose subtly with a deep, quiet breath. Thank you. Sandra reached out, not hesitantly, not dramatically, but with gentle certainty, and placed her hand over his. Keanu didn't flinch, didn't withdraw. He simply accepted the contact as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For the first time in their decades-long relationship, they were not actors, not Hollywood icons, not two people connected by rumors or nostalgia. They were simply two human beings sharing a moment of truth that had been waiting to unfold for far too long. You know, Sandra said quietly, I think we both spent so many years taking care of everyone else that we forgot we deserved care too. Keanu nodded slowly. Maybe tonight is the first step toward changing that. Sandra smiled, her hand still resting on his. Maybe it is. The night air wrapped gently around them, carrying away the heaviness but leaving behind the honesty, warm, tender, and powerful. Their bond, already strong, had shifted into something deeper, something grounded in truth rather than assumption, in vulnerability rather than silence. Sandra looked at him thoughtfully. Keanu, what do you want moving forward, after tonight, after sharing all this? Keanu considered the question carefully. Then he answered with a sincerity that left no room for ambiguity. I want us to live without unspoken gratitude, he said. Without hiding how much we value each other, without letting the years slip by without saying the things that matter. Sandra nodded, absorbing his words fully. I want that too. And I want, he added quietly, to be someone you can rely on, not just in the easy moments, but in the hard ones. Sandra's breath caught, her heart warming. You already are. Keanu shook his head gently. Not fully, not the way I want to be, but I'm ready now. Sandra felt her eyes welling again, but this time the emotion was different. It was calm, grateful, open. Then I'm here, she whispered. Not just as a friend, not just as a co-star, but as someone who cares deeply about you. Keanu met her gaze with soft certainty. And I care deeply about you too. Their hands remained intertwined as the night continued, a symbolic gesture of two hearts reconnecting with an honesty that had taken years to bloom. Nothing about this moment was romantic. Nothing about it was dramatic. It was simply true. And sometimes, truth was the most powerful connection of all. The night had deepened into a velvet stillness, the sky stretching overhead like a quiet canopy that held their unfolding truths without judgment. The breeze had settled, as though even the air understood that something delicate and meaningful was taking shape between them, something that had lived beneath years of silence, friendship, laughter, professional respect, and unspoken gratitude. Keanu and Sandra sat side by side, their hands resting lightly together, forming a connection neither of them was used to initiating but neither wished to break. For the first time in their long history, they weren't hiding behind jokes, roles, interviews, rehearsals, or schedules. They were present, not as actors, not as figures shaped by Hollywood myths, but as two souls finally discovering the courage to speak honesty into the spaces where silence used to live. Sandra's eyes had softened into a reflective calm, though traces of tears still lingered at the corners. She wasn't crying now, not because she had run out of tears, but because the heaviness inside her had shifted into something lighter, something more grounded. She felt as though a part of her she had kept locked away, the part that sought emotional safety and sincere connection, had finally been acknowledged. Keanu, beside her, looked different too. The composure he wore like a familiar coat had loosened, revealing a quiet openness that had rarely surfaced so fully in front of another person. Tonight, vulnerability wasn't something he fought back. It flowed freely, without fear, held gently by Sandra's presence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Their silence was no longer about emotional hesitation. It was a silence filled with understanding, shared healing, and the slow realization that their bond had grown far beyond anything they had ever consciously named. Sandra breathed deeply, feeling the night settle around her. Then, with a thoughtful exhale, she finally broke the quiet. You know, she said softly, her voice warm but introspective, I always thought vulnerability was something you could control, something you could choose when to share. But tonight made me realize that sometimes vulnerability chooses you, whether you're ready or not. Keanu's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. I think I've been avoiding it for a long time, he admitted. It always felt easier to keep things inside, safer maybe, more responsible. I didn't want to worry people. I didn't want to disappoint anyone. Sandra shook her head gently. You could never disappoint me, Keanu, not even by being human, actually, especially by being human. He laughed softly, humbled by her sincerity. I'm learning that. Sandra looked down at their hands, still resting together between them. She didn't move them. She didn't want to. Instead, she asked, Do you ever wonder why it took us so long to talk like this? Keanu thought for a moment. Timing, he said simply. Maybe we weren't ready before. Maybe life had to teach us certain things first. Maybe we had to grow separately before we could see each other clearly. Sandra nodded, accepting the truth in his words. It's strange, she murmured. We've known each other for decades. We've laughed together, worked together, shared jokes, shared losses from afar, and yet tonight feels like the first time we're really seeing each other. Keanu's expression softened deeply. Maybe this is who we've always been, he said. We just needed the right moment to show it. Sandra absorbed his words, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She looked at him quietly, seeing not the Hollywood icon, not the man the world worshipped for his kindness, but the human being who sat beside her, gentle, introspective, quietly wounded, quietly strong. You've changed, she whispered. He raised an eyebrow slightly. For better or for worse? Sandra smiled. For deeper, you feel deeper now, more present, more open. Keanu considered that, then nodded. Losing people, losing pieces of your life, it forces you to either shut down or open up. For a long time, I chose to shut down, but I think, tonight, I finally chose the other path. Sandra squeezed his hand gently. I'm glad you did. Keanu turned toward her fully, the terrace lights illuminating his face. Can I ask you something? Something personal. Sandra's eyes softened. Of course. Were you lonely? He asked softly. All those years when the world thought you were at the top, when everyone expected you to be strong. Sandra's breath trembled. She hadn't expected the question, not asked so gently, not asked by someone who truly wanted to understand. She looked down, her voice quiet but honest. Yes, she whispered, more than anyone knows. She swallowed, her throat thickening as she continued. People think success means happiness. They think being loved by millions means you never feel alone. But sometimes, it's the opposite. You're surrounded by noise, by expectations, by pressure to smile, to be perfect, to be grateful. And somewhere along the way, your own voice gets quieter. Your own needs get ignored. Keanu's chest tightened. I understand, he said quietly, more than you know. Sandra looked up at him, her eyes searching his. Were you lonely too? He nodded. For a long time, even when I was surrounded by people, even when the world thought I had everything. I wasn't lonely because I didn't have people. I was lonely because I didn't feel understood. Sandra felt something inside her shift, an emotional alignment that made everything they had shared tonight feel even more profound. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice heavy with empathy. Keanu shook his head gently. Don't be, we all have our journeys, but I think, he hesitated, then continued with soft conviction. I think we were meant to understand each other now. Sandra's lips curved into a soft, emotional smile. I think so too. The breeze picked up lightly again, carrying the scent of jasmine from the nearby garden. For a moment, nature felt like a witness to their unfolding truth, the wind weaving around them like a quiet acknowledgement of everything being revealed. After a pause, Sandra leaned back against the cushion, her gaze turning thoughtful. Can I tell you something else? She asked, her voice steady but vulnerable. Keanu nodded. Always. Sandra took a slow breath. There were moments in my life when I questioned whether I was enough for my family, for my career, for the people who depended on me. I questioned whether I was lovable beyond my image, beyond my roles, beyond what people saw on screen. Keanu watched her intently, his expression softening with sincere compassion. And during those moments, she continued, I would think of the people who saw me without the filters, the people who cared for me without expecting anything back. And you, her voice trembled slightly. You were always one of those people, even when we didn't talk for months, even when our lives went different directions, the thought of you always made me feel like I wasn't alone. Keanu felt emotion rise in him, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but deep, warm, grounding. Sandra, he whispered, you don't know how much that means to me. She shook her head gently. No, you don't know how much you meant. You always showed up with kindness. You always saw the person, not the actress. And when things were hard, just remembering that someone like you existed in my life helped more than you realize. Keanu inhaled slowly, absorbing her words. I wish I had known, he said softly. I would have been there more, I would have reached out more. Sandra shook her head again, a faint smile touching her lips. You were there in the ways I needed. Sometimes presence isn't about constant communication. Sometimes it's about knowing someone out there sees you, understands you, and accepts you. You gave me that. Their hands remained intertwined, but now the touch felt heavier with meaning, with gratitude, with a shared recognition that their bond had been quietly sustaining them both for years, even when they hadn't spoken it aloud. You know something? Sandra said, a small laugh breaking through her emotion. We were never just co-stars, we were never just friends. Keanu tilted his head slightly. Then what were we? Sandra met his gaze with a soft, reflective intensity. We were each other's anchor, quiet, distant at times, but always there, like a safe place we didn't realize we were holding for each other. Keanu exhaled slowly, deeply. Yes, that feels right. Sandra's eyes softened. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had talked like this earlier? If we had let ourselves be vulnerable years ago? Keanu thought for a moment, then shook his head thoughtfully. I think everything happened exactly the way it needed to. We weren't ready then, but we are now, and maybe that's what matters. Sandra nodded, accepting the wisdom in his words. I agree. I think if we had opened up earlier, it wouldn't have felt the same. We needed our separate journeys. We needed the pain, the success, the heartbreak, the distance, all of it to appreciate this moment. Keanu smiled softly. Life has a strange way of preparing us for the people who matter. Sandra breathed deeply, letting the truth sink in. Yes, and I'm grateful you're one of those people. Keanu met her gaze with quiet warmth. And I'm grateful you're one of mine. The night air seemed to hum with unspoken emotion as the two of them sat there, realizing just how much they had shaped each other's lives, not through grand gestures or constant presence, but through the rare gift of being a person who made the other feel understood. Their bond had grown not from intensity, but from sincerity, not from drama, but from honesty. And tonight, that bond felt stronger than ever. Sandra finally leaned back, exhaling softly as she looked out over the city. There's something comforting about talking with you, she said, something grounding. Keanu nodded, and you make things feel lighter. She laughed quietly, touched. I guess we balance each other out. Maybe we always did. They shared a smile, gentle, meaningful, familiar. Then Sandra turned to him once more, her expression thoughtful. Keanu, what do you need now? What does your heart need after everything you've carried, everything you've shared? Keanu didn't answer right away. He took a slow breath, letting the question settle in him. Then he said with quiet conviction, I think I need connection, real connection, not the surface-level interactions the world gives me. I need honesty. I need truth. I need someone I can trust with the parts of me I've kept quiet for too long. Sandra felt her heartbeat quicken, not from romance, but from the depth of what he was revealing. And do you feel like you have that now? She asked softly. Keanu looked at her with a sincerity that felt like a warm hand placed directly over her heart. Yes, he whispered, with you. Sandra inhaled sharply, emotion swelling through her so deeply she couldn't contain the small tear that escaped. I feel the same, she whispered. You're someone I can be real with, maybe more than anyone else. Their gaze held not romantic, not intense, just truth layered upon truth. And in that moment, they both understood that their bond had evolved into something rare, something rooted in emotional safety and deep mutual respect. They were not lovers. They were not just friends. They were something deeper, two souls who had finally found a place where they could rest without pretending. The night had grown so late that it was beginning to lose its identity. It wasn't quite night anymore, yet the morning still felt worlds away. Time had dissolved around Sandra and Keanu in a way that only happened when truth was finally allowed to breathe, when long-suppressed emotions finally found the right moment, the right place, the right person. The terrace lights had dimmed into softer glows. The city below now shimmered like a sea of quiet dreams, unaware that two hearts on the hill above it were unraveling years of silence and rediscovering something they had both needed for far too long: genuine connection free from the pressures of fame, expectation, and performance. Sandra sat with her legs curled slightly to the side, her posture relaxed in a way that felt almost foreign to her after decades of maintaining an image of composure. Keanu sat beside her in a calm stillness, his presence steady and grounding, as if the world itself had ceased to move and he was content simply being here, in this moment with her, with honesty. Their hands were no longer intertwined, but the space between them held a softness that made the air feel warm even in the cool night breeze. Sandra inhaled deeply, letting the weight of the evening settle into her chest with a strange mixture of heaviness and relief. She could still feel the lingering tremors of vulnerability, the way her voice had cracked earlier, the way her emotional armor had fallen apart piece by piece, not in a collapse, but in a gentle release that felt long overdue. She glanced at Keanu, noticing how his shoulders looked lighter, how the lines beside his eyes had softened, how his entire presence seemed unburdened in a way she hadn't seen in years, maybe ever. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sat together in the space carved by honesty, letting the remnants of their emotional confessions settle. Finally, Sandra broke the silence with a reflective sigh. It's strange, she said softly, her voice steady but contemplative. We came up here tonight as old friends, comfortable, familiar, grateful, but tonight feels like something shifted, like we crossed a bridge neither of us realized we were standing on. Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. I felt it too, he said. Something opened up, something we didn't even know needed opening. Sandra smiled gently. It feels like we finally met each other after 20 years. He chuckled softly, but his eyes held truth. Maybe we did. She leaned back, letting her head rest lightly against the cushion as she watched the sky stretch overhead in a quiet expanse. "Do you ever think about how many conversations we never had?" she asked quietly. "How many times we smiled through things we couldn't explain? How many times we showed up strong when we should have admitted we were hurting?" Keanu's gaze softened with deep understanding. "I think about it a lot," he admitted. "Not just with you, though you're at the top of that list, but with so many people I care about. I always assumed my burdens were mine alone, that if I shared them, I would be adding weight to someone else's shoulders." Sandra turned her head to look at him, her brow softening. "You don't have to carry everything alone anymore," she said. "Not with me." He held her gaze, his expression warm. "And you don't have to pretend to be strong with me," he replied gently. "Not anymore." Sandra swallowed hard, emotion tightening her chest. "Maybe that's what real connection is," she whispered. "Not romance, not partnership, not labels, just the freedom to show up exactly as we are. No performance, no masks." Keanu nodded slowly. "I think we both spent too long learning how to be strong in silence," he said. "Maybe it's time we learned how to be strong in truth." Sandra's eyes softened, shimmering with gratitude. "I like the sound of that." The breeze brushed lightly against them, carrying the faint scent of the night jasmine that grew along the side of Keanu's home. It was almost surreal, how peaceful everything felt now, after an evening of unraveling emotional weight that had been accumulated over years. Sandra had always been wary of deep conversations, afraid they would expose too much open wounds, complicate relationships. But tonight, none of that fear existed. The truth had been gentle, healing, necessary. Being understood, truly understood, was a rare gift. And tonight, she had been given that gift by someone she had admired quietly for years. Sandra took another slow breath before speaking again. "Keanu, the letter, everything you shared, everything you held on to, why now? Why tonight?" He looked down at his hands briefly before answering. "Because a few weeks ago," he began softly, "I realized something important. I was sitting alone in my house, thinking about the people who mattered most to me, the ones who shaped me even without knowing it. And I realized that I had said barely any of it out loud. I had allowed years to pass without speaking the gratitude that lived in my heart." Sandra listened closely, her expression tender. "And then I asked myself a question," Keanu continued. "If something happened tomorrow, would I be okay knowing I never told Sandra what she meant to me?" And the answer was no. I wouldn't be okay with that. Her heart trembled. "Keanu." He looked up, his eyes warm but resolute. "I didn't want to leave anything unsaid anymore, not with you, not with someone who helped me heal, even without knowing it." Sandra placed her hand over her heart, breathing through the emotion swelling inside her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for trusting me with something so personal, for letting me see you." He nodded gently, "And thank you for seeing me." Another moment of quiet passed between them, rich with understanding. Then Sandra asked something she had never dared to ask before. "Did you ever feel like we missed something?" she said slowly. "Not romantically, just something deeper, a chance to understand each other better earlier in life, to connect before the world distracted us." Keanu didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the city, thinking, reflecting, searching his heart for honesty rather than convenience. Finally, he spoke. "No," he said softly. "I don't think we missed anything. I think everything happened exactly when it was meant to happen. If we had opened up earlier, we might not have been ready. We might not have appreciated it. We might not have had the emotional tools to handle something so deep." Sandra nodded, taking in the wisdom. "You're probably right," she murmured. "Timing is everything." Keanu smiled. "And this feels like the right time." Sandra returned the smile, but then her expression grew thoughtful. "So, where do we go from here?" Keanu inhaled deeply, his voice steady. "I think we keep showing up like this," he said. "Not in dramatic ways, not with pressure or expectations, just honestly, consistently, as people who care for each other deeply." Sandra felt warmth spread through her chest. "I'd like that." "And I'd like," he continued gently, "to be someone you can rely on, not just as a friend, not just occasionally, but someone you can call when things are hard. Someone who can support you the way you've supported me without even realizing it." Sandra blinked, the sincerity of his offer touching her deeply. "That means a lot," she said softly, "more than you know." Keanu shifted closer, not physically but emotionally, and added quietly, "And Sandra, I don't ever want you to feel alone again. Not when you carry so much love, so much strength, so much compassion for everyone else." Her throat tightened. "And I don't ever want you to carry your pain in silence again," she whispered. "Not when you have so much depth, so much kindness, so much heart to give." They held each other's gaze again, the mutual promise lingering in the air like a vow made without ceremony. For the first time in years, Sandra felt safe. For the first time in years, Keanu felt understood. The connection between them had shifted into something neither of them had words for. Something rare, something profound, something built on vulnerability and held together by truth. Finally, Sandra let out a soft, almost amused breath. "You know what's funny?" she said. "People always assumed there was something mysterious between us, something romantic, something hidden. But the real truth, the real connection was deeper than that. It wasn't about romance. It was about recognition, emotional recognition." Keanu nodded. Two people who saw something in each other the world didn't. "Exactly." They sat together for several more minutes, watching the sky shift into a faint shade of midnight blue. The night was beginning to fade, signaling the slow approach of dawn, but neither of them felt tired. In fact, they felt more awake, more alive than they had in years. Eventually, Sandra straightened slightly, a soft, tender smile curving her lips. "Keanu." "Yes. Thank you for tonight, for everything, for letting me see the real you." He held her gaze with gentle certainty. "Thank you for letting me see the real you too." Sandra hesitated for a moment, then added softly, "I feel lighter." He nodded, "So do I." "And hopeful," she whispered, "more hopeful than I've felt in a long time." He smiled, warm, real, almost relieved. "Hope suits you." She laughed quietly, her chest warm. "And honesty suits you." They shared another smile, a smile rooted not in performance, not in nostalgia, but in genuine affection. Finally, Sandra rose from the bench, smoothing her sweater as she looked around the terrace one last time. "I should go," she said gently. "If I stay any longer, I might start confessing my entire life story." Keanu stood as well, chuckling softly. "I don't mind, but we can save that for next time." Sandra nodded, touched by the promise of future conversations. "Yes, next time." She gathered her things, holding the envelope carefully, the letter now more precious than ever. She started toward the terrace doors, then paused, turning back to him with a soft expression. "One more thing," she said. Keanu stepped closer. "What is it?" Sandra walked toward him, stopping just within arm's reach. She placed a hand over his heart, light, gentle, grateful. "You mattered," she whispered, "back then and now and always." Keanu felt emotion swell in his chest, his voice quiet but steady as he replied, "And so did you, more than I ever said." Sandra smiled, warm, heartfelt, sincere, and then she stepped back, giving him one last look before opening the door and disappearing inside. Keanu remained on the terrace for a long moment, letting the cool air wash over him, letting the emotional weight of the evening settle into something peaceful. He looked out at the city again, the lights glowing softly like a quiet reminder of the world outside. But tonight, none of that noise mattered. Tonight, he had spoken truth. Tonight, he had been seen. Tonight, he had allowed himself to connect with someone who had unknowingly shaped his life in ways he finally had words for. And as he remained there in the early hours of dawn, he realized something profound. This wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning. Not of romance, not of rumor, not of some Hollywood fairy tale, but of a deeper, truer connection, one built on honesty, gratitude, and the resilience of two human spirits who had spent far too long carrying their burdens alone. Tonight they shared them. Tomorrow they would walk forward lighter. And perhaps, just perhaps, the world would never know the depth of what passed between them. But they would. And that was enough.